Professor Knipprath, welcome to Constitutional Chats.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for having me again. And there's another essay on the way soon, so we may need to up that number. And just one note, I think I must have started when I was 12 years old at Southwestern. I can't believe so much time has passed so quickly. So thank you very much for that introduction. So our topic today regards the Roman Republic and its eventual collapse, and what might have caused that, and how might we avoid that, or perhaps mitigate it to some extent. There's the old saying that Rome was not built in a day, which is certainly true. Just as with our Constitution, the Constitution of the Republic of Rome did not spring forth fully and never change. In fact, the Roman Constitution was built on custom. There's not really a written document called the Roman Constitution, even though some fragments of what's called the 12 Tables remain, and this is kind of almost more like a written code of criminal and civil law. So the Roman Constitution was a product of custom. And as one might imagine, there were various people that wrote about different aspects of the Roman Constitution over time. And in the essay that I wrote, I focused on was probably the preeminent commentator, which was a Greek, I want to put this hostage, or a Greek guest of the Romans for a while, by the name of Polybius, who then stayed around and became prominent in Roman circles. And so he wrote about the Constitution of Rome, the Roman Republic, when it was, in a sense, at its peak, at its highest effectiveness and its highest domain as far as the Republic itself was concerned. So we can discern the basic structures of the Roman system, which was a form of mixed government. Right? The ancient writers oftentimes talked about pure forms of government, the good form and its corrupt twin, and then you get people like Aristotle start to talk about a kind of mixed government, and Polybius saw in the Republic of Rome a particularly effective mixed government, which combined elements of monarchy, which the framers, talked about, not monarchy as such, but about the president as a unitary executive, providing energy. And today also the president represents the country as far as we are concerned, dealings with others, right? Kind of a chief of state. Well, that's the way that the monarchies were supposed to work back in ancient times. And Polybius saw the consuls of Rome as the equivalent of a monarch. Then there was the aristocracy represented in the Senate, initially an aristocracy of landed nobles, but eventually you could get into it if you're among the highest group of commoners based on your wealth, and if you held certain offices, you could become part of the Senate as well. The Senate was the most significant, if one wants to say, a single institution of the Roman Republic. It technically had only a consultative role. It did not have formal roles like we have for our Senate that are specified in Article 1 of the Constitution primarily. It was technically only a consultative body, but because of the custom in Rome over many, many generations of the Senate being the body that was in charge of financial matters, that was in charge of foreign relations, because they consistently met. So they were constantly meeting. They had life terms, so they got a lot of influence that way. Everything basically had to go through the Senate. The consuls couldn't act unless technically they had some kind of authorization from the Senate, which was called a consultation. But it was really effectively an authorization from the Senate. And then there were the Assemblies, which came a little bit later than the Senate did in its development in Roman constitutional history. And there were a number of assemblies, but all Roman male citizens belonged to the Assemblies. And the Assemblies were in charge, technically, of actually passing laws. The problem with the Assemblies was that they had to meet in Rome, and that you had to attend in person. Another problem with the assemblies was why it wasn't like our system, was that the assemblies were divided into voting groups. I'll just very generally say voting groups based on your wealth, with the equitus, the knights, the biggest landowners being at the top. And the way the voting occurred ended up with the top 2 or 3 of the 5 classes dominating the voting. That basically those in the lower classes of landholders or the landless poor, which were in the 6th class, typically their votes didn't matter, because by the time they got around, their groups got around to voting, the upper groups, which had more numbers and which dominated the proceedings, would already have decided whether the law was passed. So the assemblies did provide some source of voice for the people of Rome, the citizens of Rome generally, but they were not the main policy-making body. Then there were I mentioned the consuls earlier, the monarchical element, but it was quite different from the typical monarch in that consuls were only elected for 1 year. And they would, in the early days, not be permitted to run again for 10 years. Now that didn't change. That changed as the republic merged, sort of metamorphosed into the empire. But initially, you couldn't run for another 10 years. And to be a consul, you had to have gone through this ladder of honor, as it was called. You had to have started with lower offices and then been found capable there. Then you get elected to something higher. And so you had to go through this process, as well as there were age limitations. You had to meet a certain minimum age. One of the great consuls, Cicero, went through these stages, each time at the earliest possible age. So he was quite successful in that regard. And there are typically 2 consuls. And one of the things our framers of our Constitution talked about was this concept of a unitary executive. But there was quite a tradition in ancient sort of executive positions to have a dual office. One reason the Romans did that, like the Spartans, was to have somebody in the city and somebody who would be mostly in charge of the military operations that took place typically outside the city. While they're both in the city, they could check each other. So there was also the concern about not concentrating power too much, with a limited term, not being able to become reelected, and there were people watching him. And then finally, there were the tribunes, which were supposed to be the representatives of the tribes of Rome. Now, tribes is not an ethnic concept. It was simply a sort of constituency based on geography in the city. The city was divided up into 10 tribes. So these tribunes were representatives of the commoners, and they were the closest thing to what we might call due process for people that the Roman Constitution had. In that the tribunes, if you were a commoner, you believed you were mistreated by the magistrates or by Roman law somehow, you could appeal to the tribunes, and the tribunes can then take up your case and potentially even veto actions taken by other officials of the Roman government. And it's actually a very fascinating interplay of different forces. And just as we have a lot of lectures and discussions and sessions about the American Constitution, one could do the same thing about the Roman Constitution. It really doesn't do it justice to try to deal with this in just even 1 hour. But the reason it's important is because the framers of our Constitution so identify with the Roman Republic. And Roman Republic was kind of an idealized version of the Roman Republic for them. They adopted in many of their writings the names of Roman statesmen as pseudonyms. So they saw themselves as representing the kind of virtue of this idealized Roman Republic. So they were very familiar with the operations of Rome. Now, the big issue, of course, is why did it collapse? And again, historians have argued about this for a long time. One might identify, perhaps very broadly, maybe 3 causes that would have contributed to this. One of them was we might call the impoverishment of the yeomanry class, of the artisans and farmers. Without getting too deeply into this, there was a growth in the size of the estates as Roman nobles and new rich people bought up land because that was realistically the only source of acceptable wealth for those in power. And this created these great latifundia, as they were called, so that the farmers that had been on these small estates ended up moving to the urban areas as Rome grew. At the same time, you have the development of a slave culture. The conquered peoples would be enslaved oftentimes, and they would be brought to Rome, which then was cheaper than the urban yeomanry, the artisans, and so on and so forth, as well as for those landless farmers who come in and work in the factories of Rome. Well, it was cheaper to have the slave labor. So that contributed to the growth of this underclass. Connected to that was the growth of the power of these provincial governors, the proconsuls, for example, these generals that could serve for a long period of time. And as the military connection to landed wealth diminished, these generals armed those poor who would now serve them and develop this loyalty to these generals. So the growth of the empire and the need to govern that empire began to exceed the capacities of a system, a constitutional system that was designed for a city-state, a community that knew each other, where the citizens would all gather and vote in their assemblies. Well, now people were spread out all over the empire, and they would have to come in to vote in those assemblies. They couldn't afford that. So the assemblies, in that sense, participation withered considerably. So the entire structure of administering the empire, realistically an empire, exceeded the capacities of the Republic, which didn't adapt sufficiently in a way that would be able to handle that empire. A very small town can be governed by participation of the people directly, a New England town meeting. But as the framers recognized, as Madison wrote about this a number of times in the essays, as the size grows, you need representative bodies. And then the system can adapt to that a little bit better. Well, the Romans never did, because in the assembly, you still had to show up to vote. So you can't have that when you're governing areas from near Persia to the Atlantic Ocean. The other thing that's interesting to me that sometimes has been said contributed to the collapse of the Roman Republic was something that, interestingly, the Emperor Octavian was very concerned with when he took over. And that was what he saw as the moral decadence of particularly the elite classes of Rome. And he was not the only one to comment on this. And one is reminded of John Adams's point about governance in a republic, that a republican form of government is only fit for a moral and religious people. And there's a lot to unpack in that remark by Adams, but what he's basically getting at is that a republic depends significantly on self-restraint, willingness to work for others, a government where both the ruler and the ruled don't push things to extremes, balance, we might call it. Octavian, he attributed in part the collapse of the Republic to that problem of a increasing decadence in Rome. So very short then, the expansion of slavery and the destruction, or at least the lessening of the power of the middle class of artisans and yeoman farmers, the imperial structure, which needed some kind of reform, and the collapse of moral, shall we say, moral focus and the degeneration thereof.
Well, those are great opening comments, and you packed a lot into a very few minutes. So thank you so much. I don't know that I ever realized how intricate the Roman governmental structure was, and what how they had organized their constitutions. Amazing. You had mentioned Cicero, and I know that our framers admired Cicero a great deal. Could you talk just a little bit more about Cicero and why our founders thought so highly of him?
Yes, Cicero came to represent kind of a republican figure, in a sense, a myth. And there was a lot to admire about Cicero, and there are also some things that were more questionable about Cicero. But he was sort of the symbol of Roman republicanism, in part because of the offices he held, in part because of his name as an orator. We have to remember that his oratory, which to some of us today sounds at times a little bit overwrought, was studied all the way down to the 18th and 19th centuries as a form of oratory and rhetoric to be followed. So there's a lot written about him. Plus, he wrote some works that a couple of books in particular about the Roman constitution, which came down to us, and the framers certainly knew about those. He was killed by the really at the instigation of Mark Antony, much to the somewhat chagrin, I suppose, of Octavian at the time, who was a bit of a protector for a while of Cicero. So Cicero became kind of a martyr to the Republic. He was also an exceedingly successful politician before then. As I said, he was quite bright, politically astute. So in that sense, he presented a symbol of the Roman Republic to the framers.
Okay, well, great. Well, I know that Tova and Jewel have got some great questions lined up. So Tova, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this is a fascinating topic, and I think it's, as you said, it's hard to condense it, but you really did a great job. So I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that the sort of Roman constitution or way of governance wasn't written down. And I know obviously at Constituting America, we talk a lot about our written constitution and how important it is. So I was curious how you think the fact that they didn't have a written constitution affected the way that the government is run, if at all.
Yeah, so when I say there wasn't a formal written constitution, that was kind of a novel thing for the United States, American contribution to constitutional development, if you want to call it that. But that's not to say that there weren't written components of the Roman constitution. So if the Senate came up with some kind of a consultum, some kind of a decree that was fundamental to the system of governance, or there was some kind of other accord that was written down, some kind of arrangement that was fundamental to governance, then we could say that was part of a constitution. So just as in England, the British Constitution is said to be unwritten, but there have been, everything from British enactments of parts of Magna Cartas to various other acts of Parliament that are fundamental to the way the system operates. And so we can say that that's part of the British Constitution because it tells us how the system is expected to operate and what gives it legitimacy. So the Romans had that. The other thing that was very important to the Romans, and they talked about this, was what they call the custom of the ancients or the traditions of the forefathers. To that, the how we always have done things carried a lot of weight in Roman society. It was a very conservative force in that sense. That influenced the decisions about how people operated. And it was violations of how we've always done things that created constitutional crises. So when he wasn't the first one, but it's a famous one, when Caesar crosses the Rubicon River with his army, this is seen as violating a fundamental custom of Rome that there is not to be an army within the city and within a certain distance of the city. As I said, he wasn't the first one to do that. But so that's what the force of custom was. And if we think about it, our system also operates significantly on custom, how we have done things. Just to take one little aspect of this, when the Supreme Court, given the importance of this issue currently, when the Supreme Court got into this whole area of the right of privacy, beginning with contraception back with the case of Griswold versus Connecticut. One of the issues that came up is, well, there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about contraception. How do we deal with this? And a couple of the justices said, well, we look at our legal customs and traditions. How have we generally handled this in the past? How did the common law handle this? It was the right of married people, at least, to use contraceptives within marriage, one of those rights that the state traditionally in our systems stayed out of. And they determined that, yes, it was. So the role of custom in informing how we fundamentally run things is important for us as well in our jurisprudence.
Great, thank you. And then so you were mentioning kind of about the fall of the Roman Republic, which I think a lot of people are very interested in with parallels to our current situation. And you mentioned that one reason is just that simply the Republic got too big and kind of heavy for what it was originally intended to be. And with America, you see, when we were founded, we were much smaller, much more homogenous, much more limited geographically than we are now. We've just gotten huge economically, population, geographically, militarily. So do you see any parallels between the two in terms of the size getting too big? And how do you think we can adapt to kind of avoid the fate of the Romans? But again, knowing that we also have a written constitution that is not as easy to change, and we don't necessarily want to change it a lot. So how do we find that balance?
That's a really interesting question that we all might have opinions about, and there are no easy answers. I would suggest that one of the things that would help, whether or not that's going to happen is a different issue, but that would help would be more of a devolution of power to more local entities, whether it's states and counties and so on and so forth, basically restricting the federal government to the kinds of things it was initially intended to do. Because the more you have matters decided at the local or state level, the more you might get a sense of community and attachment to those entities than you do with Washington. And again, we might say, well, wait a minute, that's crazy. When the entire United States at the time of the Constitution was under $4 million people, $4 million too, but 4 million people. And today, the city of Los Angeles, when you drive on the freeway, it's probably announced as a population of 4,045,000. So it's crazy. At the same time, there is a possibility here, because what was spread out at the time, the United States being so spread out, the communications and interactions among Americans were much more constrained than they might be today, for better or worse. Right. So today, the size of the United States may not be much different to the average American than the United States was at the time to the people living there, simply as a matter of communication, transportation, and so on. But the trend towards executive government has always been there in the American Constitution. And that's what we see towards that kind of centralized bureaucracy, that trend towards an elective monarchy, in a sense. We have to remember that Octavian, and for generations after that, the emperors tried to maintain the appearance of the republic with the Senate and the consuls and all of this. Octavian simply called himself a first citizen. Like we refer to the first lady, for example. Well, that's kind of what Octavian's wife was as well, the wife of the first citizen. There are concerns about this. The best we can do, my opinion, is within the reality of the modern world to try to devolve as much political decision-making to lower levels under sort of principle of subsidiarity.
Great, thank you. That's a really fascinating discussion. And again, I appreciate you getting these huge topics down to just small questions. So I was curious, you were discussing how big of a factor wealth was in the Roman Republic. Everything from like daily interactions to whose votes have the most power. So I was curious, why do you think wealth became such a major force in Roman culture? Was that unique at the time, or was that just like everywhere in the world, wealth was just a major thing, or was it kind of a uniquely Roman phenomenon?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to talk about everywhere in the world. I have no idea what was going on in Mali and Cambodia and so on. But simply, I think your point was this common in the Western systems like Greece and Rome and areas surrounding them? And the answer was generally yes. It was to balance the population at large with the interests of the wealthy. It also had to do with the concept of citizenship at the time, that those who were wealthier had more at stake and therefore would be more likely to be careful and not as readily jump to rash emotional decisions. The other connection was between citizenship and military service. And one has to remember how the military was constructed. The classes that the assemblies were divided into, the commoners, which also included some wealthy, that were perhaps wealthier than the patricians that controlled the Senate, was based on what could you provide for the state when the state called on you for military service. So the knights at the top would be the ones who would be in the cavalry. They would be able to provide horses and retainers to help out with that. The next level down would be the infantry that could provide the best armor and the best weaponry for the time. And then there'd be further down, there'd be light infantry that wouldn't have as fancy shields, might not have armor, might have other kinds of weapons that were not suitable for the kind of infantry clash that was common in those battles. And then the landless poor, where'd they go? The Navy. Because there you didn't have to provide weapons. All you had to do was provide a body that could row the galleys. So your worth to the city and later the broader structure, the state, as a military matter would also be connected to your wealth, and that would be connected to what you deserved as far as voting was concerned. And that was not at all uncommon.
Thank you. And then my other question is, you were talking about sort of moral degeneracy in the Roman Republic, but what were their standards of morality that they were slipping from? Like, what did Romans value for politicians or for everyday people? What was virtue to them?
Yeah, so there's oftentimes a complaint that, hey, morality is collapsing, right? I remember in the day, that sort of attitude. That said, one can see certain trends that would happen. One of the things that Roman writers were complaining about, interestingly enough, was that Roman women weren't having enough kids at the upper levels. That they were more interested in a life of indulgence. There was too much, things were getting too soft. Now, whether that was, sort of just a general sense and apprehension, that people were too interested in making money. There's another complaint. Coming especially from the patricians who were limited theoretically to only getting wealthy through land rather than commercial enterprises, but then they would try to get around that. The issue of corruption, that reflected a lack of character. So all those complaints that one oftentimes hears then and now, that people wrote about in Greece, that people wrote about in Rome, but there are periods where these things do tend to happen, and then there's a reaction against that, where there are community standards that say, hey, you can't engage in this. Some people, systems pass laws, as they had in the Americas, in the colonies, against certain kinds of vices like gluttony and opulence and that sort of thing. So it's a common complaint. To what extent it actually was different than before, 100 years earlier, is difficult to assess.
Got it. Well, thank you so much. This is just such a fascinating topic we could talk about for an entire series, but I'd love to now pass on to Joel.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
All right. So a very cool introduction to Roman politics. Similar to what Kathy said, I was surprised to hear the intricacy, even though, of course, we hear about America's founders being so closely tied to Rome, and we hear of the parallels between America and Rome, particularly from often conservatives saying, be wary of the fall of Rome. I have a question as far as in Roman government, had the concept of rights or the concept of anything restraining those who governed, what could they basically do anything if it had passed in the assembly or the other bodies that you had mentioned?
Yeah. So what you're bringing up here is I touched on it very briefly with the tribunes. What we might call due process in a very broad sense. And this was not a notion that was part of the Roman law at the time. So the protections you got were basically administrative, political. That you could go to the tribunes and complain, and then they would take that, sort of like an administrative process to other places, investigate, and so on. The idea that you had these inalienable rights, right, that put a limitation on government was not an aspect of Roman law at the time. That came through, there was a development of that came through the Stoics, which the Stoic philosophy, which began to infiltrate, if you want to call it that, Rome, the Roman Republic, and became kind of a state philosophy after a while. And there was a lot about that there's the inherent dignity of individuals. So we can see the germination of our concepts of due process there. Cicero developed this through the natural law that he starts talking about, this sort of universal morality that puts limits on government. But it wasn't per se a recognized feature of the Roman constitution. The balance that happened there was through political interactions and the limits that the Senate could put on the consuls, that the assembly could theoretically put on the Senate through the passing of laws or disagreement with the Senate's consultum, or the election of officials was done by the assembly. So there was this kind of interplay of governmental entities that could serve to protect individuals, right? Our framers talked about that too, that the point of separation of powers, the structure, the point of federalism was not to provide jobs for government officials, more government officials. It was to put ambition against ambition, as Madison phrased it, and thereby indirectly protect us, to some extent at least, against arbitrary actions of government. The Bill of Rights, with the express limitations, was another way to try to do this. And the Romans had the first part, some of the structural aspects, but not some sense of, as in the Declaration of Independence, that we're all given these God-given rights, or what we would have in the Bill of Rights as these, hey, because you have these God-given rights, there have to be these limitations on government. Right? That starts to come in a little bit through the Stoic view of things, but it gets cut short, by the political rearrangement through the empire. The Christians had the same kind of position, right? But Rome doesn't become a quote unquote Christian empire until the 4th century.
So then, kind of on the topic of separation of powers, the Roman, I can't remember the word you used, but the one we would see is the executive, who could be in for 1 year and then couldn't run again for another 10. What powers did that position hold possibly differently than what we'd see our president held? And then also, was there a police force separate from a military force, or who enacted the law?
As to the last point, I don't know that there was such a police force, how they were organized. I suspect that there were authorities, sources that the authorities had to quell riots, but I haven't really looked into that. And there wasn't anything like the modern police department, because the modern police departments didn't really arise until modern times. But there were always some kinds of officials or sources to enforce, to prevent riots and so on. But as to the first point, which was what really did the consuls, what powers did they have? Technically, within the city of Rome, very little. It was almost a ceremonial office, unless there was a military need. But the powers of the consuls came from the fact, and remember, consul, in a sense, is again connected to consulting. So everything was sort of indirect. But the consuls, because their class connections to the Senate, and because they had gone through this cursus honorum, this ladder of honor, by the time they got to the position of consul, and having been elected several times to these different offices, they were well-known political figures who commanded respect. So through their personalities, through their connections with the Senate, through their class status, that's what gave them influence. So people were going to listen to them. Now, quite different was the position of what was called the proconsul. The proconsul was someone who governed the provinces, and a consul couldn't be reelected for 10 years until, again, the 1st century BC, things began to fray. But you could be elected to the proconsul position, governorship of some province, over and over and over again. And in those provinces, those governors had significant power, both over military aspects and civil political controls. And they could gain centers of power there that they could then potentially use as that would threaten the Republic, and did in the latter years. Generals like Marius and Sulla, for example. But within Rome, technically, under the Constitution, consuls were basically ceremonial officials. But they were so connected, their words were very important.
Yes. So then when we discuss the fall of the Roman Republic, then the fall would be the transition into an empire and into a monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Then what do you think of so oftentimes when we hear about Rome, the discussion more so is on the fall of the Roman Empire. But sometimes, so like in my course, in one of my history courses in college, talked about the fall of the Roman Empire, but the two things were somewhat conflated. But we're talking about something probably like 600 years separated, we would say, about, right? Somewhere around there.
Close to that, about 500 years, yeah.
And then the first emperor, the first one to claim emperorhood is Caesar?
No, it's Octavian, and got these titles of Augustus, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But he himself was very careful not to call himself a monarch, right? He tried, and I suspect sincerely, to maintain as much of the Republic as was possible, as he saw possible at the time. So we can date the Roman Republic fell, but again, it didn't fall in one day. It fell over the 1st century BC, right? And then we could say, all right, we can now say that this has been more like a monarchy at this point with Augustus, and that he was really the guy in charge. Just as with the fall of the Roman Empire, again, it didn't happen in a day. It was a collapse over at least a century. And that was only in the West. In the East, the Roman Empire continued. Moreover, the German kingdoms that replaced governing the Western Roman Empire, those kings tried mightily to govern in the Roman style. They adopted Roman dress. They kept the Roman institutions around, right? So it's more like an erosion happened, initially slowly and then more quickly, right? So when people say, hey, you know, we're in trouble here with our Republican form of government, who knows whether or not we are. But even if we are, that doesn't mean the United States ends tomorrow.
Mhm.
You know,
Very interesting to think of, to think about less of a fall and more of an erosion, and so interesting to hear about the intricacies and something like I had never heard of the Tribune and those elements of Roman government before. So thank you for the show. It's 2:50, so I bet we have a bunch of audience questions because this has been interesting.
Well, thank you, Joel. Thank you for those great questions. And Tova, thank you for your great questions. Professor Knipprath, Richard Mayberry asked, you alluded to this just a minute ago, and maybe we could go just a little deeper on this point. He asked, do you see any parallels between the fall of the Roman Republic, not the empire, and conditions with our democracy and government today? Are there any parallels that pop out to you?
There are some concerns. Inequality of wealth that exists is at least something to think about. We're concerned about the erosion of the middle class, the debasement of the currency, which also happened in those decades. The concern about the erosion of moral values, of an excessive focus on self-gratification versus not. The growing power of the bureaucracy away from the at least formal organs of government, such as in Rome, the Senate and the Assemblies, to the things that were going on behind the scenes, the assassinations of officials, the use of the military by ambitious individuals. Now, we haven't had that here in this country, but we have the growing influence of intelligence agencies, of bureaucracies, the unwieldiness of government. I think those are all concerns, that might lead one to say we are heading down the same path. Now, we have it, as I said, within the Constitution. There's certainly plenty of resources in the Constitution or sources in the Constitution that would allow us to, avert that result. The problem is whether we as a culture are able to do that, have the will to do that, have the capacity to do that. Our modern conditions simply not suitable for that. We're not in the 18th century. We don't have that kind of structure, those social conditions anymore. Are we more like Rome in the 1st century BC? And who knows?
And then Regina Ford brings up inflation. Do with their current situation with inflation facing everyone, especially the middle class Americans, the yeomen, do you see strong implications for the U.S. You had talked a little bit about that with the wide gap in income and resources, but do you see any? Would you have any further comment on inflation and those parallels?
Well, the closest is that both during those latter periods of the Republic and later on, as the empire was hitting difficulty, was the debasement of the currency. The cutting of silver coins, the changing of the alloys, that reflected a period of inflation or periods of inflation. The problem I mentioned before about the land being bought up by these great landholders, the concentration of landed wealth, the concentration of, to the extent that there was manufacture in the hands of the wealthy commoners, in knights. That's potentially an issue, right? That creates economic, I don't know that it would necessarily cause inflation, but that creates economic strains. Inflation, yes, because it does what happened to the Roman middle classes through slavery and the acquisition of the land by the big landholders, big conglomerates, if you want to call them that in modern language, undercut the middle class, the yeoman class. And that's what the concern is about inflation today.
Okay. And then Ernie Van asked an interesting question. Could the fall have been avoided, and how? If you were advising the Roman Republic, how would you keep them from falling?
That is a really great question. And, I don't know that a single emperor could do that, a single king could do that, and certainly not sort of the diffused power centers of the Republic. I'm reminded of, what was it, the Danish king Canute is supposed to have made some reference about the futility of stopping the tides. Is this something simply that overtook the Republican structure through the growth of the empire? So maybe be more judicious about spread of empire. Be more judicious about what do you really need as far as defending what the city of Rome and its culture. Be careful about introducing this cheap labor source of slaves. Those would be the kinds of things I think I would primarily focus on, and reform the representative institutions. Try to give more voice to those people outside the city. They fought the social wars in the 1st century BC about granting citizenship. The Romans refused to grant citizenship. They finally granted citizenship to their Latin allies and cousins in the rest of Italy, right? So grant more citizenship to bring people in and have those representative institutions to tie them together better.
Okay. And Maria Wright just asked a quick question. Who took over the Roman Empire? Was it Germany, or she says she's just double checking?
Yeah, well, in the East, there was what became Byzantium. It was basically Greek-controlled emperors, or Greek-connected emperors. In the West, it was primarily German tribes. The Visigoths, the Vandals, and so on took over the territories. And again, those kings literally tried to govern like Romans. They just didn't have the wherewithal. They didn't have the administrative capabilities to do so. And then you get the Dark Ages for about 200 years until Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, or the roots of the Holy Roman Empire, come together around 800.
Thank you. And then Leanne has a great question that leads us, probably this will be our last question, but it leads us to talk about a show that we have coming up as well. We have a show coming up on June 7th, where we're going to have Michael Maybach talking about the Electoral College, but how republics currently and throughout history have chosen their head executive. And looking at our Electoral College today and the need to, people, there are people that believe that they want to reform the Electoral College or get rid of it altogether. But could you talk to us a little bit about the importance of the Electoral College, and then also how Rome, any parallels to how Rome selected their head of state, that maybe the founders were inspired to create our Electoral College by?
Yeah, I think a more direct antecedent of our Electoral College is the way that the German princes elected the Holy Roman Emperor later on, because there's a direct connection there. The Romans themselves, the consuls were technically elected by the assemblies, but the assemblies were controlled by the rich because, again, you don't want people simply, the idea was you don't want people, one person, one vote in that sense, vote directly, because they're more likely to be driven by passions, and it's going to lead to these sort of demagogues taking over. So Romans didn't want, or wanted to try to avoid that in that system. So you didn't have anything like the Electoral College, but it's always been the concern, do we want people voting directly? Are they fit to do so, to be blunt? Or is this going to lead to people being simply selecting the best speaker or the most corrupt person who bribes them, versus having some body, intermediary bodies, nominate and elect?
Well, thank you. And this has just been such a great program. And we thank you so much for being back with us today. And I want to check in with Joel and Tova and see if either of you have any parting words for us.
I just appreciate the information very much. We think about the Greek form of government more, and then just go right to the Roman Empire. So it was pretty cool to focus on the Roman Republic since it's so important to our founding. So appreciate that, Professor Knipprath.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joel.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. This is just such an incredible topic that I loved learning about. And thank you everyone for joining us. I think we had more people than we usually do. So welcome to, if you're new, please stick around. We have these every week. And if you're not, we really appreciate you watching every week with us. It's definitely been a journey. So thank you all so much and have a great week.
Thank you, Tova. And as Tova said, thank you to our audience. We really appreciate you all being with us today and your comments and your questions. And thank you, Professor Knipprath. Such a great show. Thank you so much. And we'll
My
see
pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Bye.